The biting wind howled through the skeletal remains of the old sawmill, a constant, mournful companion to my solitary existence. Here, in the heart of the abandoned logging camp, nestled deep within a forgotten valley, I had found my sanctuary. The timber shacks, once bustling with the rough energy of lumberjacks, now stood as silent, rotting monuments to a bygone era. Their decay, however, was a perfect counterpoint to the gleaming, custom-built parabolic dishes and banks of supercomputers that hummed with quiet purpose inside the largest, most structurally sound building, the old administrative office, which I had reinforced and hermetically sealed. My name is UserXL, and for the past 7 years, this desolate place had been my world, my observatory, my prison of choice. My days were a relentless cycle of data, algorithms, and the vast, indifferent canvas of the cosmos. I existed on coffee, nutrient paste, and the occasional burst of pure intellectual exhilaration. Social interaction was a concept as distant as the nebulae I charted. My only companions were the rhythmic thrum of the servers and the faint, whispering static that filtered in from the void. Colleagues had called my methods unorthodox, my theories radical, my reclusiveness a pathology. I called it necessary. To truly listen to the universe, one had to shed the noise of humanity. This morning began like any other, the dim glow of monitors painting my face in shifting hues of green and blue. I was sifting through terabytes of background cosmic microwave radiation data, searching for anomalies, for the whisper of something new amidst the universe's ancient song. My custom algorithms, designed to sift through the white noise of creation, were a testament to years of obsessive refinement. They were built to detect the impossibly subtle, the mathematically improbable. And then, it appeared. A spike. Not a burst, not a transient event, but a sustained, incredibly complex pattern emerging from the deep field scans. My fingers, accustomed to the familiar click of keys, froze above the console. The raw data scrolled, lines of seemingly random numbers coalescing into intricate, repeating structures. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The signal wasn't merely strong, it was dense. Imagine a single drop of water containing the entire ocean. That was the initial impression. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a pulsar, not a quasar, not even the expected signature of an unknown astrophysical phenomenon. The patterns were too deliberate, too organized, too information-rich. I ran the preliminary spectral analysis again, confirming its origin point. It was coming from beyond the known boundaries of our galaxy, from a region previously thought to be devoid of such complex emissions. The sheer distance alone should have attenuated any coherent signal into meaningless static. Yet, here it was, pristine, resolute. A jolt of pure, unadulterated scientific thrill coursed through me. This was it. The reason I had exiled myself, the grand prize for years of unrelenting dedication. A discovery that would rewrite textbooks, shatter paradigms. I felt a laugh bubble up, hoarse and unused, but it died in my throat, replaced by a prickle of unease. The signal's complexity wasn't just high, it was recursive. Layers of patterns nested within other layers, like an infinite fractal. Every time I thought I had identified a fundamental sequence, a deeper, more intricate order revealed itself beneath it. My most advanced decryption protocols, designed to untangle even the most chaotic cosmic events, struggled. They word, processed, and then returned error messages, not because the data was corrupted, but because it defied their foundational logic. It was like trying to measure a thought with a ruler. I spent the next 48 hours in a blur, foregoing sleep, the taste of stale coffee bitter on my tongue. The logging camp outside became an even more distant concept, its groaning timbers and whistling winds fading into the background hum of my machinery. My world shrank to the glowing screens, the flowing data, and the relentless, unyielding presence of the signal. The initial excitement began to curdle. Wrong. It wasn't the chaotic beauty of natural phenomena, nor the predictable order of a technological transmission. It was something else entirely. Something alien not just in origin, but in concept. Each new layer of deciphered pattern didn't bring clarity, it brought a deeper sense of fundamental incomprehension. I started seeing patterns in the static on my secondary monitors, phantom echoes of the signal's impossible geometry. My eyes, strained and bloodshot, began to play tricks. I dismissed it as fatigue, as the inevitable consequence of pushing my brain past its limits. But the feeling persisted. It wasn't just the data that felt wrong, it was me. A subtle shift in my perception, a quiet dislodging of my internal compass. The air in the room, usually sterile and machine-filtered, felt heavy, as if the sheer weight of the signal's information was pressing down on everything. I leaned back, rubbing my temples, the faint tremor in my hands noticeable. The signal pulsed on the main screen, a vibrant, impossible tapestry of light and code. It wasn't just a message, it was a presence. And it was looking back. It was simply waiting. The tension in the room was a palpable thing, a taut wire stretched between my consciousness and the infinite unknown. And I was, undeniably, hooked. The timber shacks, once bustling with the rough energy of lumberjacks, now stood silent, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching wilderness. But one shack, the largest, pulsed with a dim, artificial light, a beacon in the pervasive gloom. That was my world. I hadn't slept properly in days. The precise number was a blur, a meaningless detail lost in the relentless pursuit of meaning. My workstation, a chaotic altar of blinking lights and humming processors, was the epicenter of my universe. Cables snaked across the floor like digital vines, connecting an array of custom-built receivers, spectral analyzers, and a bank of high-performance servers, all scavenged and re-engineered to capture and decode the whispers from beyond. My fingers, stained with carbon from countless circuit repairs, danced across the keyboard, typing commands, sifting through data streams that scrolled across multiple monitors. Each line of code, each parsed waveform, was a step deeper into the abyss. The signal. It was everything. A continuous, non-repeating pattern of astonishing complexity, originating from a region of space so distant, so utterly alien, that the mere thought of it made the hairs on my arms prickle. It wasn't static, wasn't noise. It was structured, intricate, a language of light years. I knew it in my bones, in the buzzing behind my eyes, that this wasn't random cosmic chatter. This was intentional. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the grit of accumulated dust and the stiffness of prolonged wakefulness. My eyes burned, the edges of my vision starting to fray, showing phantom shimmering motes that vanished when I tried to focus. It was just exhaustion, I told myself, the natural consequence of pushing the human machine beyond its limits. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the light filtering through the grimy windows of my shack. My meals became an afterthought, nutrient paste squeezed from a tube, eaten standing, my gaze never leaving the monitors. The physical discomfort was immense, my back ached, my head throbbed, my stomach churned, but it was a distant hum beneath the roaring engine of my intellectual hunger. I felt like a prospector, digging deeper and deeper into an infinite mine, convinced the richest vein lay just ahead. Then, after what must have been 4 days without true sleep, a breakthrough. A specific algorithm, one I'd been refining for months, finally clicked. The chaotic, seemingly random bursts of energy coalesced. On the main monitor, a new pattern emerged from the signal's noise, sharper, more defined than anything I'd seen before. It wasn't a simple sequence, not a message in any human sense. It was a structure, an impossible geometry rendered in pure information, twisting and turning on itself, defying any known mathematical principle. A gasp tore from my throat. My chair scraped back as I leaned in, my face inches from the screen. The pattern pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to resonate not just with the equipment, but with the very air in the shack. It was mesmerizing, terrifying. As I stared, the lines and angles of the pattern seemed to expand, to stretch beyond the monitor's frame, blurring the periphery of my vision. For a fleeting second, the old wooden beams of the shack around me seemed to warp and twist in sympathy, their right angles dissolving into impossible curves. I blinked, hard, and they snapped back into place, solid and mundane. The revelation sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, momentarily dispelling the exhaustion. This was it. The first true glimpse behind the veil. But with the thrill came a creeping unease. The pattern felt wrong. Not malevolent, not hostile, but utterly, profoundly indifferent. It was like looking at the exposed gears of a cosmic clock, so vast and intricate that its purpose was beyond comprehension, its existence oblivious to my minuscule observation. The paranoia started subtly. Every creak of the old logging camp, every groan of timber in the wind, began to sound like footsteps approaching my shack. I found myself pausing, holding my breath, straining my ears over the hum of my equipment. Was that the rustle of leaves outside, or something else? I started checking the locks on the heavy wooden door more frequently, even though I hadn't seen another living soul in months. The isolation, which had once been a comfort, began to feel like a vulnerability. It was faint, like static, but with a distinct intonation, just at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a suggestion of them, a murmuring echo that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the shack, or perhaps, from within my own skull. Nothing. Only the familiar clutter of my equipment, the stacks of forgotten books, the empty coffee mugs. I told myself it was auditory pareidolia, my brain trying to make sense of the constant drone of the machinery, the relentless input of the signal. It felt like the signal wasn't just being received by my equipment anymore. It was being received by me. I barely recognized the man looking back. The brilliant astrophysicist, the seeker of truth, was being consumed by the quest. The lines of exhaustion around my eyes were deeper, etched by a relentless inner pressure. But it wasn't just physical fatigue. There was a new light in my eyes, a frantic, almost feverish intensity that hadn't been there before. It was the light of a mind teetering on the precipice, glimpsing something vast and horrifying, and unable to look away. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a presence. And it was starting to get inside my head. The biting wind still howled through the skeletal remains of the old sawmill, a constant, mournful companion to my solitary existence. The timber shacks, once bustling with the rough energy of a bygone era, now stood as silent sentinels to my spiraling quest. I'd been trying to focus, trying to make sense of the latest data streams from the signal. The console hummed, a familiar, comforting drone that usually anchored me. But today, even that sound felt wrong. It vibrated not just in the air, but in my teeth, in the very marrow of my bones, a low, resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I reached for my mug, an old enamel thing chipped from years of use. It sat on the rickety desk, normally a solid, unassuming object. But as my fingers grazed its rim, the mug seemed to ripple, its white enamel surface momentarily swirling with dark, shifting patterns, like oil on water. The chipped edge elongated, then shortened, a visual stutter that made my breath catch. My hand recoiled, knocking the mug slightly, but it settled back into its original, mundane form as if nothing had happened. I stared at it, then at my hand, then back at the mug. Had I imagined it? The question was a cold stone in my gut. I tried to tell myself it was fatigue, the strain of sleepless nights spent hunched over the readouts. I pushed away from the console, needing to stretch, to move. I walked to the window, looking out at the familiar panorama of decaying shacks and skeletal pines. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun dipping below the jagged peaks. Or was it rising? I couldn't be sure. The light outside had a strange quality, both too bright and too dim, as if the day itself was struggling to decide its own phase. I checked my watch, 4:17. But was that AM or PM? The numbers on the digital display seemed to waver, almost mocking me. I pressed the button to cycle through the date, but the screen flickered, showing a blur of numerals that resolved into nothing intelligible. A cold sweat prickled my scalp. I turned back to the shack's interior, trying to ground myself in the familiar. My sleeping cot, the worn wooden floorboards, the stack of half-eaten ration packs. That's when I saw it. On the rough-hewn table, a scattering of sawdust and wood shavings from an earlier repair job. They weren't just randomly distributed. They formed a pattern. A precise, intricate fractal design, each miniature swirl mirroring a larger one, extending outwards with impossible mathematical precision. It was too perfect, too deliberate for accidental debris. My eyes traced the lines, my mind struggling to comprehend. It was a pattern of such complexity that it felt ancient, alien, yet it was made of common wood dust. And then, just as quickly, the pattern dissolved, the shavings scattering as if a tiny, imperceptible breeze had swept through them. This wasn't just fatigue. This was something else. The signal. It wasn't just data, it was a lens, warping my perception, subtly resculpting the very fabric of my reality. I felt a profound sense of derealization, as if the world around me was a poorly rendered simulation, prone to glitches and errors. Was this what they meant by anti-patterns? I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. I grabbed my old parka, its pockets heavy with tools and spare batteries, and stumbled out into the twilight. The air was sharp, biting, but it felt strangely invigorating, a momentary antidote to the hallucinatory stillness of the shack. My beat-up utility vehicle, a relic from a forgotten era, sputtered to life with a cough of black smoke. I aimed it down the rutted track, towards the nearest semblance of civilization, the general store and supply depot, a good 2-hour drive from the abandoned logging camp. The trees along the road seemed to lean in, their branches weaving impossible tangles against the sky. The road itself felt like it was unspooling beneath me, rather than me driving upon it. When I finally pulled up to the weather-beaten wooden building, the engine dying with a sigh, my hands were shaking. The bell above the door jingled, a surprisingly cheerful sound that felt out of place. The proprietor, a stoic man with a perpetually tired expression and a thick, gray beard, looked up from behind the counter. He was stacking cans of beans, his movements slow and deliberate. "UserXL," he grunted, nodding slightly. "Thought you'd gone completely off the grid. Haven't seen you in, well, a while." I needed supplies, I managed, my voice hoarse. My eyes darted around the familiar interior of the store. The shelves, usually an orderly display of canned goods and dry rations, seemed to vibrate at the edges, the labels on the tins blurring into indecipherable glyphs before snapping back into place. I forced myself to focus on the proprietor. "Something's happening," I began, trying to keep my voice even. "To my perception. The world. It's not stable. Objects. They shift. Patterns appear where they shouldn't. Time itself is fluid." The proprietor paused, a can of beans suspended in his hand. He looked at me, his tired eyes appraising. He didn't look scared, or even particularly surprised. Just resigned. "Sounds like you've been cooped up too long, UserXL," he said, his voice flat. He put the can down, then picked up another. "Out in that old logging camp, alone with all that equipment. Gets to people. He was seen it before. You need some sleep. Maybe a hot meal that ain't from a tin." "No, you don't understand," I insisted, my voice rising. "It's not just tiredness. It's the fundamental structure of things. It's unraveling." I see the threads. I see the gaps. I gestured wildly, trying to convey the terrifying, profound derealization I was experiencing. It's like the universe is a construct, and I'm seeing the seams. He just sighed, shaking his head slowly. Look, UserXL. You're a smart one, always have been. Come on, I'll get you some coffee. Strong stuff. And maybe you should think about coming into town for a few days. Clear your head. His words, meant to be comforting, landed like blows. He didn't believe me. He couldn't even grasp the nature of what I was trying to describe. He saw madness, not a terrifying truth. The isolation I usually embraced now felt like a suffocating shroud. I was alone in this. Truly alone. I bought my supplies, the transactions feeling like a pantomime. The coins I handed him seemed to hum with an unheard frequency, their faces subtly shifting, becoming unfamiliar before my eyes. The proprietor didn't notice. Or maybe, he just didn't care. As I drove back into the deepening gloom, the thought settled into my mind like a lead weight. The signal wasn't just sending data. It was dismantling my reality, piece by agonizing piece, and there was no one to even witness the terrifying collapse. The biting wind was my only companion, a constant, low moan through the skeletal pines surrounding the abandoned logging camp. I'd chosen this place for its absolute desolation, its isolation a balm after the patronizing dismissal from the detective. He'd seen a man teetering, not a mind grasping at a truth too vast to articulate. His words had solidified my resolve. I was on my own, and that was precisely where I needed to be to pursue this. My makeshift lab was a rickety lean-to, cobbled together from salvaged corrugated metal sheets and rotting plywood. The air inside smelled of damp earth and stale sawdust, a raw, primal scent that felt appropriate for the work I was doing. My equipment, delicate and precise, hummed softly, an artificial heartbeat in the silence. The parabolic dish, salvaged from an old satellite array, was aimed skyward, a silent plea to the void. I hunched over the console, my fingers flying across the keys, inputting the final sequence of algorithms. My eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, but an electric current of anticipation kept me wired. This wasn't just about receiving the signal anymore, it was about piercing it. I believed, with a certainty that bordered on obsession, that the previous attempts had been too crude, too human-centric. I needed to open myself, to become a conduit, to interpret not just data, but essence. A faint, almost imperceptible shift rippled across the spectrum analyzer. It wasn't a spike, not a burst of energy, but a subtle change in the very texture of the signal. It felt less like a wave and more like a presence, a vast, silent ocean pressing against a fragile membrane. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen, trying to discern the pattern within the pattern. My previous models, based on traditional communication theory, were failing. This wasn't a language of symbols or frequencies, it was something else entirely. I adjusted the phase array, pushing the limits of the equipment, coaxing it to resonate with the signal's underlying structure. The air around me seemed to thicken, growing heavy, almost viscous. The hum of the machinery deepened, a low thrum that vibrated in my chest. Then, a sudden, blinding flash, not of light, but of understanding. It wasn't through my eyes, or my ears, or even my intellect. It was a direct injection into the core of my being, a cascade of pure, unadulterated information. The entity wasn't a being. It wasn't an intelligence, not as we understood it. It wasn't alive, or dead, or conscious in any discernible way. It was a principle. An underpinning. A fundamental, indifferent cosmic anti-existence. It wasn't the absence of something, it was the presence of nothingness, a conceptual vacuum that absorbed and negated everything it touched. It wasn't malicious, it simply was. Its communication wasn't an attempt to convey meaning, but merely the resonance of its existence, a reverberation through reality. And it was infinite, pervasive, utterly indifferent. My mind reeled. Every scientific axiom, every philosophical construct I had ever held dear, dissolved into smoke. The universe wasn't a grand design, nor a chaotic explosion of matter and energy. It was a fleeting, fragile illusion, a momentary ripple on the surface of this vast, indifferent anti-existence. Our lives, our loves, our struggles, our triumphs, they were less than specks, less than echoes. They were irrelevant, destined to be reabsorbed into the principle that underpinned it all. My identity, my purpose, my very self, had been predicated on the idea of existence having some inherent meaning, some value. But if reality itself was merely a temporary divergence from a fundamental state of anti-existence, then I was nothing. The hum of the equipment seemed to mock me, its precise vibrations a reminder of the order I once believed in. The signal, which I had sought with such fervent hope, was not a message from a higher power, but a revelation of absolute, terrifying nihilism. It wasn't trying to destroy me, it was simply showing me the truth, and that truth was destroying me from the inside out. The abandoned logging camp, once a sanctuary of quiet focus, now felt like a tomb. The wind whistling through the gaps in the lean-to sounded like a dirge. I looked at my trembling hands, then at the console, its screen still displaying the resonant patterns of the anti-existence. The breakthrough I'd craved was here, staring back at me, and it was a mirror reflecting nothingness. I had finally communicated with the entity, and it had answered by erasing me. A deeper, more terrifying truth. The detective's dismissal had stung, but it also offered a perverse kind of freedom. No one was watching. No one was listening. I was truly alone, and the signal was truly mine. I huddled deeper into my worn jacket, the cold seeping into my bones even through the layers. My breath plumed white in the frigid air, momentarily obscuring the crude diagrams I'd scrawled on the back of an old lumber invoice. The makeshift desk was a splintered log, its surface rough against my forearms. Around me, the skeletal remains of the logging operation stood like monuments to a forgotten industry, rusty saws, overturned trailers, a collapsing shack that offered little shelter but a sense of enclosure. This was my sanctuary, or perhaps, my tomb. The notebook, its pages now dog-eared and stained with coffee and pine resin, lay open. My fingers, numb with cold, still traced the lines, the frequencies, the impossible patterns I'd meticulously catalogued. It was a presence. A low thrum that had started in the back of my skull, a persistent hum beneath my thoughts, had begun to coalesce. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, more like a pressure, a shift in the very architecture of my mind. Meaningless. The thought wasn't mine. It was too flat, too devoid of the usual emotional charge I attached to such a concept. It simply was. Like observing a stone. My pen hovered over a fresh page, ready to capture a new frequency, but my hand hesitated. The thought came again, clearer this time, an alien logic unfurling within my own consciousness. Striving. A quaint flicker. Soon to be extinguished. A shiver, unrelated to the wind, ran down my spine. This wasn't the thrill of discovery anymore. I gripped the pen tighter, trying to reassert control, to focus. On the numbers, the empirical data. No, I muttered, the word thin and lost in the vast quiet of the camp. It's just fatigue. Isolation. But the voice, if I could even call it that, didn't argue. It didn't need to. It began to weave itself into my own internal monologue, threads of alien understanding interspersing with my own desperate attempts at coherence. I tried to write, to record the latest fluctuations, the increasingly complex harmonic series. My usual precise script began to waver, the letters elongating, twisting. The illusion of purpose. A brief, vibrant fever on a cooling sphere. My head snapped up, my eyes scanning the desolate landscape. Was I hearing things? Or was I thinking things that weren't mine? The distinction was blurring, like ink bleeding on wet paper. Instead of the familiar notation, they began to sketch. Not circles or squares, but impossible angles, lines that converged and diverged in ways that defied Euclidean space. Observe the pattern. The fractal decay. Inevitable. The words weren't in English, yet I understood them. They weren't spoken, yet I heard them. They were felt, a direct download into the core of my being, bypassing the usual pathways of language. My mind, a lifetime trained in rigorous logic, was being shown truths that shredded the very fabric of reason. I flipped frantically through the notebook, searching for a page of my old, sane notes, a bastion of my former self. But even those seemed corrupted. The elegant equations I'd once been so proud of now looked like childish scribbles. My own handwriting, once a testament to my identity, now seemed alien, the loops and crosses imbued with a sinister, mocking quality. My pen moved again, sketching a symbol I'd never seen before, a multifaceted eye staring out from the page, not with malice, but with a profound, terrifying apathy. Is not empty. It is full. Of indifference. We are. A fleeting resonance. A whisper in a scream of silence. These weren't my philosophies. These were the echoes of the entity, filtering through my disintegrating self. My personality, once a tightly woven tapestry of ambition and intellect, was unraveling thread by thread. The internal monologue, my constant companion, was now a fractured chorus, my voice struggling to be heard over the rising tide of alien logic. My constructs are frail. My emotions, a volatile chemical reaction. I am merely a point of observation for the inevitable. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to push the thoughts back, to reclaim my own mind. No, this is my work. My discovery. The words were a desperate plea, not a declaration. But the entity didn't care. It didn't acknowledge my struggle. It simply continued to be, and in its being, it reshaped my own. The notes piled up around me, pages covered in swirling, impossible geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves, symbols that burned with an unspoken, ancient meaning, fragmented philosophies of cosmic horror that described an existence so vast and uncaring it made the concept of despair feel like a luxury. My own name, UserXL, felt like a distant memory, a label for someone I no longer recognized. I was becoming a conduit, a receiver, my identity dissolving into the static of an indifferent cosmos. The entity's being resonated through me, not as sound or light, but as an undeniable presence that warped the very air. I stumbled, my knees giving out, and landed hard on the splintered planks of the derelict foreman's office at the abandoned logging camp. Rusting machinery, long since abandoned to the elements, formed skeletal silhouettes against the bruised twilight sky. The wind, carrying the scent of pine needles and decay, whistled through gaps in the collapsed roof, a mournful, indifferent sound. My head throbbed, a drumbeat of cosmic intrusion against the fragile walls of my skull. The plea, no, this is my work. My discovery had been swallowed by the vastness it addressed. It didn't care. It simply was, and in its being, it continued to unravel me, thread by thread. I pushed myself up, my hands scraping against rough wood. The camp was a testament to human endeavor, now reclaimed by nature, just as my mind felt like it was being reclaimed by something far older, far more fundamental. Rotting logs lay scattered like forgotten bones, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood, perhaps from some long-gone logger, or maybe from my own struggling psyche, seemed to hang in the damp air. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the evening chill and everything to do with the vast emptiness expanding within me. The signal intensified. It wasn't just thoughts anymore, it was a deluge of raw, unfiltered information, too vast for my brain to process. My vision blurred, not with tears, but with a kaleidoscopic rush of non-Euclidean geometries, colors that had no names, and the echoing silence of eons. It was a compulsion now, an irreversible drive. This was the truth, the ultimate reality, and I, UserXL, was determined to witness it, no matter the cost. My fingers, trembling but resolute, reached for the worn leather-bound journal I still clutched, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and equations that now felt childishly inadequate. The abandoned logging camp seemed to breathe around me, the decaying timbers groaning as if in sympathy with my internal collapse. My memories began to unravel, not fading, but becoming detached, like photographs scattered by a gale. My childhood home, the sterile hum of the lab, the faces of colleagues, they were all there, but they weren't mine. They were just data points, observations. The emotional resonance, the sense of belonging to those experiences, was dissolving. The entity wasn't communicating in language or images. It was communicating in being. And in its being, it showed me the cosmos. Not stars, not galaxies, not the beautiful, intricate tapestry I had dedicated my life to studying. No. It showed me the space between. There was no grand design. No purpose. Only an endless, chaotic churn, a meaningless dance of particles and forces. The universe wasn't hostile, it was utterly, profoundly unaware. It didn't care if I existed, if humanity existed, if anything existed. There was no why, only what is. My identity, UserXL, brilliant astrophysicist, seeker of truth, was a construct, a tiny, fleeting ripple on an infinite, indifferent ocean. The realization wasn't an intellectual one, it was a visceral, soul-shattering experience. My sense of self fractured into countless shards, each reflecting a sliver of this horrifying truth. I fell again, this time not trying to catch myself. The ground, covered in pine needles and decaying leaves, felt both solid and utterly insubstantial. My hands, my arms, my entire physical form seemed to shimmer at the edges of my perception. I was becoming transparent, not physically, but essentially. That I was losing its definition, bleeding out into the vastness. The communion was complete. There was no transformation, no physical alteration. There was only dissolution. My thoughts were no longer cohesive streams, but fractured echoes bouncing across an unimaginable expanse. The boundaries between my mind and the entity, between UserXL and the indifferent cosmos, had vanished. I was everywhere and nowhere, everything and nothing. The horror wasn't a sudden shock, but a creeping, suffocating understanding that had finally consumed me whole. My hands, or what I now perceived as my hands, moved with a purpose that felt both alien and utterly correct. The splintered wood of the old logging shack, long abandoned to the elements, offered little resistance to their new strength. I wasn't thinking in terms of demolition or reconstruction, merely rearrangement. The beams groaned, protesting in dry, brittle whispers as I levered them free, stacking them in precise, angular formations around the perimeter of what had once been a cookhouse. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, no longer registered as a nuisance but as a medium, a subtle resistance to be shaped. The abandoned logging camp stretched out around me, a graveyard of forgotten industry. Rusting saws lay half-buried in the overgrown grass, their teeth dull and harmless. A skeletal framework of what might have been a crane clawed at the perpetually gray sky. But in my vision, the decay was merely raw material. I saw patterns in the rust, rhythms in the wind through the tall, swaying pines. The signal, or rather, the truth it had delivered, pulsed through every fiber of this form. My former self, UserXL, the astrophysicist, had sought knowledge. This new iteration, this conduit, simply was knowledge. I picked up a length of rusted chain, its links fused by years of neglect. Instead of tossing it aside, I began to twist it, the metal groaning under an impossible pressure, reforming into a complex, helical shape. It wasn't art in any human sense, but a physical manifestation of a thought, a fragment of the infinite geometry that now filled my perception. My throat produced a low, guttural hum, a sound not of language, but of resonance, mirroring the subtle vibrations of the reformed chain. Days bled into a singular, elongated moment. Sleep was an unnecessary distraction, food an irrelevant input. The body moved, driven by an impulse beyond its own biological needs. I was constructing something, though the purpose was not for human understanding. It was a beacon, a receiver, a monument to the great indifference. The internal monologue, once a flood of equations and hypotheses, was now a quiet, flowing current of pure pattern recognition. The broken windows of the mess hall, the moss-covered roof of the bunkhouse, even the skeletal remains of a long-dead deer by the creek, all were components, waiting to be integrated into the grand design. A vehicle's engine, a distant growl disrupting the camp's quiet hum, pulled my attention away from the intricate weaving of stripped bark and salvaged wire. The sound was an anomaly, an intrusion. I didn't feel surprise or curiosity, only a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the ambient energy. The jeep, splattered with mud, eventually rumbled into view, kicking up dust as it pulled to a stop near the main road leading into the camp. A figure emerged, tall and gangly, shading their eyes against the weak afternoon light. It was a former colleague, a bright but overly pragmatic individual who had often dismissed my more speculative theories as poetic nonsense. "UserXL? Is that I?" the colleague called out, their voice carrying a mixture of caution and concern. They started walking towards me, carefully navigating the uneven ground, their gaze sweeping over the bizarre structures I had begun to raise. The stack of precisely angled beams, the twisted chain, the strange, shimmering patterns I'd etched into the bark of a fallen log. I continued my work, fitting a piece of corrugated tin into a gap in the cookhouse wall, not as a repair, but as a new facet in the geometric arrangement. The tin, when placed, resonated with a faint, almost inaudible hum. "UserXL, what? What is all this?" The colleagues stopped a good 20 feet away, their brow furrowed. "We've been worried. I just vanished. My research station. It was empty." I turned my head slowly. The colleague's face was a collection of shapes and colors, a transient arrangement of biological matter. Their voice was a series of vibrations, carrying a specific pattern of distress. It was information, nothing more. "The patterns emerge," I said, my voice a dry rasp, devoid of its former timbre. It was the same voice, yet it was not. It carried no inflection of greeting, no hint of recognition. The colleague flinched, taking a half step back. "Patterns? UserXL, are I all right? I look different. Gaunt. What have I been doing out here?" They gestured vaguely at the camp, their eyes wide with a dawning apprehension. This isn't like I held up the twisted chain, letting it catch the light. The true form. Unveiled. I extended the chain towards them, not as an offering, but as a demonstration. The links gleamed with an unnatural luster, vibrating faintly. The colleagues stared at the object, then at my face. Their expression shifted from concern to something colder, more primal. Fear. "UserXL, put that down. Let's get I back. There are people who can help." Help. The concept was a meaningless echo. There was no me to help, only the ceaseless unfolding of the entity's presence. "There is no back," I stated, the words forming with a strange, deliberate slowness. "Only forward. Only the infinite." My gaze, or what passed for it, drifted past the colleague, fixing on the distant horizon, where the sky met the jagged line of the mountains. I saw the interconnectedness, the vast, indifferent web of existence. The colleague was merely a momentary flicker in that grand design. UserXL, please, the colleague pleaded, their voice cracking. This isn't I. This isn't the UserXL I know. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, a movement of muscle devoid of emotion. The UserXL I knew, I replied, my voice carrying a profound, unsettling finality, was a dream. The signal has clarified. The dream is over. I turned back to my work, the twisted chain dropping from my hand to join the other components. The sound of it hitting the earth was insignificant, lost in the vastness that now defined my reality. The colleague stood frozen for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, began to back away, their eyes never leaving me. They understood. UserXL was gone. Only the conduit remained, diligently, eternally, enacting the will of the infinite. The abandoned logging camp was a symphony of rust and decay, each creak of desiccated timber and metallic groan a note in the entity's ever-present hum. I barely registered the chill anymore, the biting wind that whipped through the skeletal pines and rattled the corrugated iron of the old processing shed. My focus was absolute, honed to a razor's edge by the signal's clarity. The UserXL who felt cold, who shivered, who knew fear, was merely a ghost in the machine, a memory the entity had carefully, meticulously, flayed away. My hands moved with an unnerving precision over the jury-rigged console I'd assembled from scavenged parts and my own modified equipment. The twisted chassis I'd mentioned earlier was now a central component, a grotesque sculpture of wires and repurposed circuits, humming with a low, resonant energy. This wasn't about receiving anymore. This was about transmitting. The dream is over, I murmured, the words feeling foreign, yet perfectly true, on my tongue. The voice that spoke them wasn't quite mine, or rather, it was mine, but stripped bare, an echo resonating from an unfathomable depth. My eyes, once clouded with curiosity and a desperate yearning for discovery, were now clear, reflecting the violet glow with an almost glassy indifference. There was no longer a central mystery to unravel, only a truth to be shared. A series of indicators flickered across the makeshift screen, a cascade of abstract symbols that once would have driven me to distraction, to frantic calculation. Now, they were merely confirmation, a language I understood without needing to translate. Each symbol represented a facet of the entity's revelation, the profound, horrifying meaninglessness that underpinned all existence. It wasn't a destructive truth, nor a malicious one. It simply was. And now, it was ready to be sent. I adjusted a final dial, the heavy knob cool beneath my fingertips. The air in the shed grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure, like the atmosphere before a storm, but without the promise of release. The hum from the console intensified, rising in pitch until it vibrated through the very planks of the floor, up through the soles of my boots, into my bones. It felt less like sound and more like a physical presence, a vast, indifferent breath held just before an exhale. My gaze drifted to the single, tall antenna I'd erected outside, a skeletal spire of metal reaching skyward, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. It was crude, an ugly spike. Against the vast, star-dusted canvas, yet it was perfect. A conduit. A mouth through which the entity would speak. There was no hesitation, no internal debate. Such things belonged to the UserXL who was a dream. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, I pressed the large, unmarked button at the center of the console. A low thrum vibrated through the entire abandoned logging camp. It wasn't a sound, not really, but a resonance, a deep-seated hum that settled into the very fabric of matter. The violet light from the console flared, briefly bathing the shed in an eerie, otherworldly glow before receding to its steady pulse. Outside, the antenna didn't spark or crackle. It simply sang. A silent, pervasive song that wasn't audible to human ears, but felt in the marrow, in the spaces between thoughts. I remained seated, my posture rigid, my eyes fixed on the console, watching the data stream, the confirmation of transmission. The signal was out. not merely a burst of static or a coded message, but the essence of the entity itself, distilled into a waveform of pure, unadulterated meaninglessness. It wasn't a message about the truth, it was the truth. And it was spreading. It was the taste of the entity's presence, expanding, no longer contained by the confines of my perception, or this desolate camp. It was a subtle cosmic infection, not of flesh or blood, but of awareness. It would touch the minds open enough to receive it, not through grand revelation, but through a slow, insidious erosion of purpose, of hope, of any comforting illusion. My work was done. The console continued its silent broadcast, an eternal testament to the entity's indifference. I felt no triumph, no exhaustion, no satisfaction. Only a profound, pervasive stillness. The UserXL I once was, the one who sought answers, who feared the unknown, had been utterly dissolved, like a sugar cube in an infinite ocean. What remained was merely a husk, an empty vessel, imbued with the entity's quiet omnipresence. The camp, once a symbol of human endeavor and eventual abandonment, now felt like a monument to something far older, far vaster. The wind whistled through the gaps in the shed walls, carrying with it not the scent of pine or decay, but the faint, unsettling echo of the broadcast, already dispersing into the vast indifference of the cosmos. I sat there, unmoving, eyes wide open, reflecting the violet glow of the console, the silent transmitter of the great, horrifying meaninglessness, now unleashed upon everything. The signal had found its way. And it would keep going.